want to talk today about something that sits much closer to many fathers than we often admit, and that is anger. Not anger simply as an emotion, because anger itself is not always wrong. There are things in life that should stir righteous anger. There are moments of frustration that should alert us that something needs attention. But I'm talking about anger when it begins to shape the way we father, when it leaks into our tone, our discipline, our reactions, and ultimately the emotional climate our children live in. If we are honest, most fathers have had moments they wish they could redo. I've certainly had them. Moments where fatigue, disappointment, pressure, or wounded pride mixed with authority, and with all that together, something in us came out harder than we intended. And one of the things I've come to understand is that anger in those moments is rarely just about what is happening right in front of us. It feels that way, of course. It feels like we're reacting to disrespect, irresponsibility, or disobedience. But often those moments are pulling energy from someplace deeper. A child ignores a request, and our response seems far bigger than the offense requires. Why? Because perhaps it touched a fear of losing control. Perhaps it activated an old wound around respect. Perhaps we were already carrying stress and had little emotional margin left. My point is that anger often attaches itself to the moment, but it is not born there. And when we do not recognize that, we can begin to mislabel what is happening in us. We can call volatility strength. We can call intimidation leadership. We can call wounded power discipline. Fathers can do this sincerely, believing they are simply being firm, while never asking whether something unhealthy has slipped into the way they lead. What makes this dangerous is that anger can create the illusion of authority because it often gets immediate results. It can produce compliance. It can silence a room. It can force outward obedience. But compliance, remember, is not trust, and silence is not respect. A child may submit externally while withdrawing internally, and when that happens repeatedly, the hidden cost of angry fathering often begins to show up not in open rebellion, but in relational distance. Sometimes that distance is subtle. A child becomes cautious around dad. A son stops bringing struggles to him. A daughter learns to perform so she does not disappoint. These things often develop quietly, which is why they can go unnoticed until years later. And that is why this matters so much, because the cost of angry fathering is rarely paid only in the moment. It is often paid in the relationship. One conviction I've come to hold deeply is this: correction without connection often feels like rejection. That does not mean fathers should avoid correction. Children need boundaries. They need standards. They need fathers with backbone. But there is a profound difference between correction delivered through grounded love and correction delivered through emotional force. Children do not simply receive our words. They receive our tone, our posture, and our emotional presence. In many cases, they interpret those things before they interpret the content of what we were saying. That means a father may intend to correct behavior while a child experiences condemnation. Healthy discipline says a choice was wrong. Shame suggests there's something wrong with the child. Those are very different experiences. And one of the dangers of angry fathering is how easily correction can drift toward shame without a father even realizing it. I think many men repeat patterns here they've inherited. Some grew up under criticism that was constant. Some were raised in homes where anger set the emotional tone. Some learned early that mistakes invited harshness. Unless those patterns are examined, they often reproduce themselves under pressure. And fatherhood has a way of exposing what is still unhealed in us. I've come to see that not merely as discomfort, but as an invitation. Sometimes the places our children trigger us are the very places God is revealing where we still need formation. This is why questions like, why did that provoke me so much? Or why did I feel the need to overpower rather than guide are not condemning questions. They're liberating ones because self-awareness is where change begins, and emotionally healthy fathering grows there. Something else I've come to believe is that much of male anger that we see is often frightened energy. It rarely looks like fear. It looks forceful. It looks commanding. But underneath, it may be fear and insecurity all the same. A father fears his son is drifting, and that fear can come out as control. He fears his daughter may be hurt, and it emerges as overcorrection. He fears family struggles reflect failure in him, and it comes out as criticism. Fear often leaks sideways, and when it does, it frequently takes the form of anger. That matters because children in moments of struggle do not primarily need a father's alarm. They need his steadiness, especially when they've failed, especially when they are confused, especially when they've made poor decisions. Because in those moments, children are often asking, even silently, "Do you still believe in me?" How a father answers that question through his response carries enormous weight. Will failure be treated as fatal or formative? Will mistakes become occasions for humiliation or mentoring? Wise fathering does not ignore wrongdoing, but it addresses failure in ways that preserve dignity. Angry fathering often reacts to failure as threat. Mature fathering engages failure as formation, and those create very different children. One reason this conversation matters so much is because angry fathering does not always leave dramatic scars people can point to. Often, its effects are subtle and cumulative. A child may become cautious. Another may become hyper-responsible, always trying not to disappoint other people. Another child may withdraw emotionally. Some may mirror the anger they live under. Others may absorb it inwardly and become anxious or self-condemned. Children adapt to emotional climate, and that is what should sober us. Sometimes what children are adapting to, fathers have normalized. I have often said your anger can become your child's anxiety, and I believe there's truth in that. Children do not merely hear what we say, they feel what it is like to live around us. That is why self-regulation is not peripheral to fatherhood. It is part of fatherly leadership. A father who can govern himself lends stability to his home, and stability is a kind of shelter for your family. Some of the strongest leadership in a family is invisible. It is measured responses. It is refusing to discipline in the heat of escalation. It is lowering your voice rather than raising it. It is slowing down enough to respond rather than react. That is disciplined strength, and children flourish under that kind of strength. I want to make sure that this podcast episode isn't peddling guilt, because here's the truth. Every father has failed. Every father has had moments he wishes he could redo. The issue is not whether rupture ever happens. The issue is whether repair happens. And repair is part of mature fathering. Some of the deepest trust in relationships grow not because mistakes never occurred, but because humility entered after they did. I think some fathers still believe apologizing to children weakens authority. I believe it strengthens it. When a father says, "I was wrong, I was harsh, I spoke in anger, will you forgive me?" something powerful happens. Children witness integrity. They witness humility. They learn what owning wrong looks like. And perhaps just as importantly, they experience relationship being restored, that it's possible for conflict to exist and yet relationships to be restored. I would go so far as to say some fathers could change the atmosphere of their home simply by becoming quicker to repair, not defensive, not self-justifying, not blaming the child for provoking the response, but owning it. That kind of humility is not weakness, it's mature masculinity. The lie many men believe is that gentleness is weakness, but I've come to believe the opposite. Gentleness is strength under disciplined control. Because listen, it does not take much maturity to erupt when provoked. Anybody can do that. But it takes a deeply formed man to remain composed when emotions rise, to stay tender while remaining firm, and to hold authority without turning it into force. Some of the strongest fathers I've known were also among the gentlest. They were not permissive or passive. They held boundaries and confronted wrongdoing, but they did it without emotional violence. Their strength felt protective rather than threatening, because power without tenderness can become domination, while power governed by love becomes protection, and children flourish and trust under protection. I think many fathers underestimate how profoundly calm strength shapes a child's inner world. A father whose presence is steady becomes a refuge, and that may be one of the greatest gifts a man can give to his family. Another hidden danger of anger is that it narrows perception. It makes a father focus only on behavior and may miss what may be underneath it. What looks like defiance may be actually confusion. What looks like laziness may be discouragement. What looks like attitude may be hurt. Fathering at its best learns to interpret before reacting. It asks, what might be happening beneath this behavior? How do I shepherd the heart here, not merely suppress the symptom? That changes how we respond, because children are not problems to manage, they are souls to form. Some of the most important fathering happens when we see beneath the surface. That's especially true in adolescence, where behavior often comes wrapped in inconsistency and awkwardness and resistance and emotion. That's true of most teenagers. If a father only reacts to the surface, he may miss the invitation underneath, the invitation to mentor, to guide, and to move toward rather than simply clamp down. That often requires slowing anger enough to see clearly. There's a passage in the Epistle to the Ephesians, chapter 4, that I think speaks directly into fatherhood. Paul writes, "In your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil a foothold." It is a remarkably practical word, and I think many dads miss how much wisdom is packed into those few lines. What strikes me first is that Paul does not say, don't ever be angry. He assumes anger will be part of life. It's a natural human emotion. There are things worth being angry about. There are moments when anger alerts us, again, that something is wrong, that a boundary has been crossed, that justice or protection is needed. So the problem is not that anger exists. The question is what anger becomes when it's left unchecked. When Paul says, "In your anger do not sin," he is acknowledging that anger can move in two directions. It can remain a signal that helps us respond wisely, or it can become something corrosive. It can move from concern into control. It can move from correction into condemnation. It can move from moral conviction into personal harshness. And fathers know how thin that line can be. A legitimate frustration with a child's behavior can quickly become a tone that wounds. Discipline can become driven by irritation rather than love. And what began as leadership can become domination. This is why Paul's warning matters. He's not saying anger is the sin. He is warning that anger can become a doorway into sin when it governs us instead of us governing it. Then Paul says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. I do not think he is merely giving us a literal clock as though every conflict must be perfectly resolved by bedtime, but I think he is warning against letting anger settle in and harden, because anger rarely stays static. When it lingers unexamined, it tends to evolve, doesn't it? It gets bigger. It can become resentment. It becomes bitterness. It can become emotional distance. And for fathers, unresolved anger often leaks into the atmosphere of a home long before it shows up in words. It can surface in impatience or criticism, sarcasm, withdrawal, or a tone children learn to tiptoe around. This is what makes unresolved anger so dangerous. It does not remain contained. It spreads. And then Paul says something even stronger. Do not give the devil a foothold. Wow, that is striking language. A foothold is a place of leverage, a point where something destructive gains access and begins to exert influence. Paul is saying unmanaged anger can become that kind of opening. It can create division in a marriage. It can create rupture between father and child. It can allow shame, fear, hostility, and generational patterns to take root. That is why angry fathering is never a small matter. It's not merely emotional. It truly is spiritual. But what I love about this passage is that embedded in the warning is also hope. Paul is not only diagnosing danger, he is showing a path. Face anger honestly, deal with it quickly, refuse to nurse it, justify it, or let it settle into identity. Bring it into the light before it gains leverage over your heart or your home. I sometimes think one of the most spiritual acts a father can do is deal with his anger before it deals with his family. Now, some men listening may realize angry fathering is not simply an occasional struggle, but a pattern that was inherited. Maybe harshness was normal in your home. Maybe volatility shaped your understanding of authority. If so, I want you to hear me clearly. Inheritance is not destiny. Patterns can be broken. You do not have to pass on what was passed on to you. In fact, one of the redemptive callings of fatherhood may be allowing healing to stop with you, becoming the man who says, "What formed me will not have the final word in what forms my children." That kind of change usually does not happen through inspiration alone. It happens through humble, practical, and often hidden work. It may mean learning your triggers well enough to recognize anger rising before it takes over. It may mean stepping away before disciplining. It may mean inviting accountability. It may mean doing deeper healing work around wounds that you've minimized for years. Because sometimes what we call an anger problem is actually an unhealed pain problem. And fathers willing to face that do profoundly important work. I often return to a hard question for dads. Everyone says they would die for their kids, but would you heal for them? That question exposes something important because some of the greatest sacrifices fathers can make are invisible. The work of repentance, the work of inner growth, the work of transformation, and that kind of work blesses generations. Let me close here. The opposite of angry fathering is not weak fathering. It is peaceful strength. It is authority expressed through trust. It is correction wrapped in connection. It is disciplined power. It is a father whose presence steadies a home. And every man can grow toward that, even if anger has marked part of his story. Maybe especially then, because grace does not simply forgive, it reforms. And maybe that begins with honesty, with the father saying, "I see this in me and I want something different." That is where change starts. Children do not need perfect fathers. They need fathers growing in wisdom, fathers humble enough to repair, fathers brave enough to face themselves, fathers strong enough to be safe. And perhaps that is the deeper invitation. Not simply manage your temper, but become the kind of man whose peace becomes part of your children's inheritance. Because when a father learns to govern his anger, he does more than improve discipline. He changes the emotional climate of a family, and sometimes he changes generations.